Late at night, when the phone screen finally dims and the endless scrolling stops, a strange silence often appears. In that silence, a quiet question sometimes slips in. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a simple thought. How can someone earn more money every year yet still feel as if they're falling behind? There is a certain kind of person living quietly in many modern cities. They are not poor. In fact, their income would look respectable on paper. Their paycheck arrives twice a month, their bank account never hits zero, and yet something always feels unfinished. Something always feels fragile. The rent rises, subscriptions quietly multiply, a weekend dinner becomes a routine expense instead of a celebration. And slowly, without noticing it, life begins to resemble a treadmill, moving constantly, but never really arriving anywhere. This person has a name in behavioral finance, not a real name, a psychological one: the prisoner of appearance. A prisoner not locked behind bars, but inside a quiet social performance. The performance looks ordinary: a slightly nicer apartment, a newer phone, clothes that signal progress, vacations that look good in photos. None of these purchases are extreme. Individually, each one seems reasonable. But together, they create a strange gravitational pull. Every dollar earned begins to carry a silent assignment: keep the lifestyle intact. And this is where the trap quietly forms. Income rises, but expectations rise faster. A promotion appears, and within months, the new salary is already spoken for. Better furniture, better restaurants, better experiences. From the outside, it looks like success. From the inside, it feels like pressure. Because something unsettling begins to happen. Despite earning more money than ever before, there is still no sense of financial breathing room, no quiet cushion, no real momentum, just maintenance. The strange part is that no one ever planned this outcome. No one wakes up thinking, today I will build a life where every dollar must immediately disappear. But behavioral psychology explains the pattern clearly. Humans adapt incredibly quickly. What once felt luxurious becomes normal. What once felt optional becomes expected. This phenomenon has a quiet name: lifestyle inflation, and it moves slowly enough that most people never see it happening. Imagine a snowball at the top of a hill, but instead of rolling downward and growing larger, it melts a little every month. Not dramatically, just enough that it never becomes powerful. Every raise melts, every bonus melts, every financial opportunity dissolves into the background of everyday spending. So the question slowly becomes unavoidable. If income alone cannot create financial freedom, then what actually does? Some people eventually notice the pattern, usually not through numbers, but through a strange emotional moment. A moment when two people meet, two people living in the same neighborhood. One earns $90,000 a year, yet feels permanently stressed about money. The other earns $50,000 and somehow has a full year of expenses quietly sitting in savings. The difference is not intelligence, not luck, and surprisingly, not even income. The difference is something much more invisible. It is the moment when someone realizes a simple but uncomfortable truth. Many purchases are not made for survival. They are made for social signaling. To appear stable, to appear successful, to appear as if life is moving forward. But appearances rarely build wealth. They only maintain the illusion of it. And once that illusion cracks, a much deeper question appears. A question that almost no one asks early enough. If most spending is quietly designed to impress people who are barely paying attention, then what would happen if that money was allowed to quietly grow instead? And more importantly, how much money does it actually take before growth finally begins working on its own? Because the answer is far smaller than most people imagine, and understanding that number changes everything. There is a strange misunderstanding about wealth. Many people imagine it requires extraordinary intelligence, or perfect investment timing, or access to secret opportunities. But the deeper truth is much quieter. Wealth rarely begins with brilliance. It begins with momentum. A single snowball, small at first, almost unimpressive, but placed on the right slope. The slope is time. The force behind it is something that financial textbooks often describe too coldly: compounding. Yet compounding is not simply mathematics. It is patience disguised as a financial system. Imagine placing a small snowball at the top of a long hill. Push it once, it grows slightly. Push it again, a few more flakes attach. But then something subtle begins to happen. Eventually, the snowball becomes large enough that gravity takes over. From that moment forward, the hill does most of the work. Money behaves in exactly the same way. The early stage feels painfully slow. The first few $1,000s appear to do almost nothing. The next few thousand behave similarly. Growth is barely visible, which is why so many people abandon the process early. It feels too small to matter, too slow to feel meaningful. But something remarkable happens once a certain threshold appears. At that point, the snowball stops depending on constant pushing and begins rolling under its own weight. Financial researchers often analyze this threshold carefully, not as a fantasy number, but as a practical turning point, a level where compounding finally becomes visible. For many long-term investors, that line appears surprisingly close: $100,000. Not $1 million, not $500,000, just the first 6 figures. At first, this number may sound intimidating, but the logic behind it is simple. Imagine placing $100,000 into a broad market index fund. Nothing exotic, just a quiet investment reflecting the growth of thousands of companies. Historically, such funds have averaged around 6 to 8% annually over long periods. At 6%, something interesting happens. In the first year, that money quietly produces $6,000. No overtime shifts, no additional work, just growth. The second year becomes slightly different. Now the $6,000 itself begins working. Growth no longer depends only on the original investment. It begins feeding itself. 10 years later, the annual growth can approach $9,000. 20 years later, the yearly increase may exceed $16,000. And at that point, something psychologically powerful occurs. The investment begins saving more money each year than many households are able to save from their own salaries. The snowball has gained gravity. But there is a hidden rule that determines whether this process survives, a rule that many people accidentally violate. They interfere. Markets fall temporarily. Headlines panic. Friends discuss the latest investment trend, and suddenly the snowball is lifted off the hill, sold too early, moved into cash, or scattered into risky shortcuts promising faster results. Every time this happens, the momentum collapses. Compounding only works under one fragile condition: it must be left alone, not ignored completely, but respected, protected from emotional reactions, protected from impulsive decisions, protected from the constant noise of financial news. Because the true power of compounding does not come from intelligence, it comes from consistency over long periods of time. And once that principle becomes clear, a new question begins to emerge. If $100,000 is the turning point, then the real challenge is not investing. The real challenge is reaching that first snowball. How does an ordinary person cross that invisible line, especially while living in a world designed to constantly pull money away? The answer does not begin with complicated strategies. It begins with 3 quiet shifts. Shifts that transform money from something that disappears into something that quietly multiplies. And those shifts are far simpler than most people expect. Once the illusion breaks, a different kind of thinking begins. Not dramatic, not revolutionary, just quieter. The realization arrives slowly. Money problems are rarely about mathematics. They are about systems. Most people attempt to build wealth through bursts of motivation: a few disciplined months, a sudden savings challenge, a temporary budget. But motivation fades. Life gets busy, and the old financial gravity quietly pulls everything back to where it was. The prisoner of appearance eventually discovers something uncomfortable. Freedom is not built through heroic effort. It is built through automatic behavior. In other words, the system must move the money before the mind has a chance to negotiate with itself. This is where the first shift appears. Not a complicated investment strategy, just a small structural decision. The moment income arrives, a portion quietly disappears. Not into spending, into investment. No debate, no decision fatigue, just automatic movement. Behavioral economists often call this pre-commitment. Humans are excellent at designing rules for their future selves, but terrible at following them in the moment. Automation solves that contradiction. The money leaves before the temptation even appears. And strangely, something psychological happens. Money that never sits in a checking account never becomes emotionally available. It stops feeling like spending power. It becomes something else entirely, a seed, a quiet worker, a future ally. The second shift appears shortly afterward, and this one surprises many people. The fastest way to reach $100,000 is not always extreme saving. Sometimes it is slightly increasing the size of the shovel, income. Not through risky speculation, not through desperate side hustles that drain every evening, but through skills already within reach. Teaching, freelance design, weekend repairs, consulting, digital services. Small streams of value that already exist but have never been intentionally monetized. These extra dollars carry a special advantage because they were never part of the original lifestyle. They have no assigned job, which means they can be sent directly toward the snowball without disrupting everyday life. And over time, something subtle begins happening again. Momentum. Each month, the investment account grows slightly larger. At first, the change is invisible. The numbers crawl, slowly, patiently. But after a few years, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The snowball is forming. The third shift is perhaps the quietest of all, and strangely, the most powerful. It involves removing expenses that never delivered real satisfaction. Not through aggressive deprivation, but through honest observation. Subscriptions forgotten months ago, convenience purchases that provided only seconds of relief, impulse spending that replaced boredom rather than solving it. These expenses often feel small, insignificant, but behavioral finance reveals something interesting. Small leaks rarely destroy wealth, but they delay momentum, and momentum is everything. Redirecting just a few $100s per month toward the compounding engine changes the entire timeline. What once looked like a 20-year journey suddenly becomes a 10-year one. What once looked impossible becomes measurable. This is the quiet escape plan. Automation, skill-based income, intentional spending. Not dramatic, not flashy, but powerful in a way most people underestimate. And once these pieces begin working together, something unexpected happens. The emotional relationship with money changes because the prisoner of appearance slowly transforms into a different identity. Not someone who earns money, but someone whose money works. Yet even here, a new danger quietly appears. Because when the snowball finally begins moving, the temptation to interfere becomes stronger than ever. And this is where many people make their most expensive mistake, the mistake that quietly resets the entire journey. The moment the snowball gains momentum is also the moment patience becomes the most valuable skill. Because the human brain is not naturally designed for compounding. The brain evolved to respond to immediate rewards, quick wins, instant feedback, visible progress. Compounding offers the opposite, years of quiet growth, numbers that move slowly, a system that often appears unimpressive for long stretches of time, which is why many people sabotage their own progress right before the most powerful stage begins. They check their investment accounts too often. Daily fluctuations begin to feel like personal victories or failures. A market drop feels like danger. A sudden rise feels like an opportunity to cash out. And emotional decisions begin replacing long-term logic. But seasoned investors often follow a very different rhythm. They observe less, not because they are careless, but because they understand a simple psychological truth. Attention can distort patience. Looking too frequently at short-term movements creates unnecessary anxiety, and anxiety leads to interference. Instead, many long-term builders check their progress only occasionally, monthly, sometimes quarterly, just enough to stay aware, but not enough to react emotionally, because compounding thrives in quiet environments. A useful metaphor appears in nature. Consider a tree planted in fresh soil. During the first few years, the growth seems unimpressive. A thin trunk, a few branches, almost fragile. Someone passing by might assume the tree is barely surviving. But underground, something far more important is happening. Roots are spreading, deep, wide, stabilizing the structure. 10 years later, that fragile shoot becomes a towering presence, providing shade, housing birds, standing firm against storms. The transformation never happened overnight. It happened through thousands of invisible days. Money behaves in a remarkably similar way. When the first $100,000 finally appears, many people feel tempted to celebrate by withdrawing some of it. After all, the journey felt long. But the true reward of that moment is not consumption, it is acceleration. Because from that point forward, the snowball begins creating its own momentum. Growth feeds growth. Each year becomes slightly more powerful than the last, and gradually something extraordinary happens. The investments begin generating more income than personal savings contributions. At that point, effort slowly becomes optional. The system continues moving forward even during periods of rest, even during career changes, even during unexpected life events. And this is where the deeper lesson reveals itself. Financial freedom is rarely about sudden wealth. It is about creating a structure that quietly works in the background of life, a structure that grows while people focus on family, on creativity, on health, on experiences that truly matter. The irony is almost poetic. The moment someone stops chasing money desperately is often the moment money begins growing most reliably, because the system finally has time to work. So the real question is no longer, how can wealth appear quickly? The real question becomes something much more powerful. What quiet decision today could begin building a snowball that will still be rolling 20 years from now? The answer rarely looks impressive in the beginning. A small monthly investment, a patient strategy, a commitment not to interfere. But over time, those quiet decisions accumulate, ring by ring, year by year, until one day, the person who once felt trapped by money looks at their life and realizes something extraordinary. The snowball never stopped rolling, and somewhere along the way, it quietly built freedom. There's a moment in every long financial journey that feels almost unreal. Not because something dramatic happens. There are no fireworks, no sudden lottery win, no overnight transformation. Instead, the moment arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. It often happens during an ordinary evening. Bills are paid, life continues. And then, while reviewing numbers almost casually, a realization appears. The investments earned more money this year than the person managed to save from their own work. At first, it feels confusing. How could money grow faster than effort? But this is the exact point where the invisible engine finally reveals itself. The snowball has become heavy enough that gravity now does most of the work. For years, the process required discipline, saving, investing, ignoring temptations, allowing time to pass. But now, something has changed. Momentum has taken control. The early years of compounding often feel slow and frustrating. Progress seems microscopic. But compounding does not move in straight lines. It moves in curves. The first 10 years build the roots. The next 10 years build the tree. And the final years build the forest. Which is why many experienced investors share a strange observation. The hardest part of building wealth is not reaching $1 million. The hardest part is reaching the first 100,000. Because before that point, every dollar must be pushed uphill manually. After that point, gravity begins helping. And once the snowball grows larger, something deeply psychological changes. Money stops feeling like something fragile. It becomes something productive. Each dollar becomes a worker, quiet, tireless, continuing the project day and night. This is where many people finally experience a sense of financial breathing room. Not luxury, not excess, but space. Space to think, space to make decisions without panic, space to say no to work that drains energy, space to say yes to opportunities that align with personal values. Financial freedom rarely means stopping work entirely. Instead, it means the freedom to choose which work deserves attention. And this freedom emerges slowly, not through risk, not through speculation, but through a long partnership with patience. Over time, the compounding engine begins generating income that feels almost surreal. At first, a few $1,000s, later, tens of thousands, eventually, numbers large enough to support an entirely different lifestyle. But interestingly, something unexpected happens to people who reach this stage. The obsession with spending fades, because the true reward was never consumption, the reward was control. Control over time, control over attention, control over life's direction. And those who understand this rarely disrupt the system that created it. They allow the snowball to continue rolling, year after year. Because once compounding begins accelerating, stopping it feels almost irrational. The machine has already been built. It only needs space to continue. Looking back, the entire journey appears surprisingly simple. Not easy, but simple. 3 quiet decisions repeated consistently. Money moves automatically into investments. Extra income feeds the snowball instead of expanding lifestyle. And patience protects the system from emotional interference. That is all. No genius required, no perfect timing, no secret information. Just consistency. Which brings the story back to the same quiet question that began this journey. Late at night, phone screen dimming, endless scrolling finally stopping. In that moment of silence, the most powerful financial question returns again. Not, how can money be made quickly, but something far more meaningful. What small decision today could begin building a snowball that will quietly change the next 20 years? Because wealth rarely begins with extraordinary actions. It begins with ordinary choices, repeated long enough for time to reveal their power. And somewhere in the background of life, while days pass and seasons change, the snowball continues rolling, quietly, relentlessly, building a future that once seemed impossible.